Part 1, The Floor. The call lasted 47 seconds. That's all it took. 47 seconds for a 5-year-old boy to undo 5 years of running, 5 years of hiding, 5 years of a man who loved 3 people so much that he convinced himself the kindest thing he could do for them was disappear. 47 seconds, and everything Yoon Park had spent half a decade building, the new name, the locked windows, the double shifts, the careful invisible life, all of it started to come apart, because his son found an old phone in a shoebox and pressed call. You have to understand who Ren was before you can understand why any of this happened the way it did. Ren was 5 years old, and he was the kind of child who made adults feel quietly ashamed of how little attention they paid to the world around them. He had learned things that 5-year-olds shouldn't have to learn, not because his life was cruel, but because loving someone the way Ren loved his father required a certain kind of vigilance. He knew which floorboard in the hallway creaked, and he stepped over it every morning without thinking. He knew that Papa's coffee had to be made before Papa woke up, because the sound of the kettle was one of the few things that didn't make his father's shoulders climb toward his ears first thing in the morning. He knew that certain words, certain names, sent his Papa somewhere unreachable, somewhere behind the eyes, a place Ren couldn't follow no matter how tightly he held his hand. He had learned all of this the way children learn the things that really matter, not from being taught, but from loving someone hard enough that their pain became a language he was fluent in before he even knew what fluency meant. So when Ren walked into the kitchen on a Thursday afternoon and found his father on the floor, not sleeping, because he knew what sleeping looked like, not resting, because he knew what resting looked like, but wrong in a way that made something ancient and cold trip inside his small chest, he didn't panic. He stood very still. He looked at his Papa's face, at the strange shallow way his chest was moving, at the way the afternoon light caught the sweat on his skin, and he made a decision with the quiet efficiency of someone who has always known, on some level, that there would be a day when it was just him. He remembered the shoebox. Papa had told him once, in the tone adults use when they are saying something that matters more than it looks like, "Don't touch this, sweetheart, these are Papa's old things." Ren had nodded and filed the information away and not touched it. Until now. The box was under the bed, exactly where he'd seen his father put it, and inside it was an old phone that still had charge, and Ren wouldn't understand until much later why his father had kept it charged, wouldn't understand the specific heartbreak of a man who told himself he was holding onto a dead connection out of sentimentality, when what he was really doing was keeping a door unlocked that he didn't have the courage to walk through. There was one contact saved in that phone. Just one name, under a number that Ren couldn't fully read, and he pressed call the way children do things when they are truly afraid, without hesitation, without overthinking, because when someone you love is on the floor and won't wake up, you stop worrying about the rules. 3 phones rang simultaneously, in 3 different offices, in the same building, 7 miles away. Now, before we get to that, before we get to what happened when those phones rang, you need to understand what Yoon Park had built for himself in the years before that Thursday afternoon. Not much, by any objective measure. A 600-square-foot apartment in a neighborhood where he locked the windows at night and kept a spare set of keys on a hook by the door in case he ever needed to leave quickly. 2 jobs, a morning shift at a cafe where he learned to smile through a fever because sick days meant gaps in the bills, and overnight data entry work he did hunched over a laptop while Ren slept, his eyes burning, his back aching, running calculations about rent and groceries and whether this month's overtime would cover the gap from last month's emergency. A life so carefully organized around the single requirement of invisibility that he had, over 5 years, become someone even he barely recognized. But it had worked. Nobody had found him. Nobody had come knocking. He had been so thoroughly erased from the life he'd run from that he had started to believe, most days, that the running was over, that he'd run far enough and long enough that staying hidden had become simply the shape of his life. His body had other ideas. The fever had been building for 4 days before that Thursday, and Yoon had pushed through it with the specific, grinding determination of someone who had long ago lost the luxury of stopping. He'd made it through Monday on sheer will and ibuprofen. Tuesday and Wednesday on coffee and the knowledge that Ren needed to be dropped at daycare and picked up and fed and read to and held. But Thursday morning he woke up and his arms felt like they were filled with something heavy and wrong, and when he tried to sit up the room tilted so violently he had to lie back down, and somewhere in the space between trying to get up and failing, his body simply said no. Not today. Not anymore. And that was how his son found him. 5 years ago, before all of this, Yoon Park had been a different person in a different life. He'd been a barista with student debt and a scholarship from a family who had spent most of his childhood telling him in small, consistent ways that people like them didn't get to want too much. He'd been an Omega who had somehow, inexplicably, fallen into something real with 3 Alpha brothers who ran the most successful logistics company on the Pacific coast, men who wore suits that cost more than his monthly rent and moved through the world like it had been built to accommodate them. The Kong brothers. Jihan, Min, and Sue. And Yoon had never, not once in all the time he was with them, fully understood why they had chosen him. That incomprehension was the crack in the foundation of everything. And someone had known exactly how to press on it. Hit the like button if this story is already doing something to you. You're going to want to stay for what comes next. Part 2, The Lie That Cost 5 Years. There is a specific kind of cruelty in targeting someone's deepest insecurity and calling it kindness. Park Sung-jin, the father of the 3 men Yoon had loved with everything he had, was a master of exactly that kind of cruelty. He was the sort of man who had spent his entire life understanding leverage, understanding that power isn't always about what you can force someone to do, but about what you can make them choose to do themselves. He had looked at Yoon Park and seen the crack immediately. Seen the way Yoon always held himself slightly apart at family gatherings, slightly braced, like someone waiting to be told the invitation had been a mistake. Seen the way he laughed a half-second later than everyone else, checking first to make sure his reaction was appropriate. Seen a young man who had been told his whole life that he was reaching above himself, and who had never fully stopped believing it. And Sung-jin had filed that information away and waited for the right moment. He found Yoon at his morning shift at the cafe, 6 years ago now. He didn't announce himself, didn't make a scene, he simply sat down at the counter, ordered nothing, and placed his phone face up between them with the calm of someone who had done this before. On the screen was a photograph, the 3 brothers in a boardroom, papers spread between them, their expressions serious and focused in the way they always were when they were working through something difficult. Sung-jin let Yoon look at it for a moment before he spoke. He said, "My sons, last week." They were discussing how to manage the situation. And Yoon, whose heart had already dropped somewhere into his stomach, asked, "The situation meaning me?" And Sung-jin said, with what looked remarkably like genuine regret, "I'm afraid so." He said, "You're a kind young man, and I think you understand that sometimes things that begin with good intentions aren't sustainable. They've been trying to find a way to tell you in a way that doesn't hurt you." He left after that. Left his coffee untouched. Didn't wait for a response. Because he didn't need one, he'd seen in Yoon's face that the seed had landed exactly where he'd intended it to. What Yoon felt standing behind the counter for the rest of his shift was not grief, exactly, not yet. It was something worse than grief. It was recognition. The horrible, hollow sense of a fear being confirmed, of the thing you have been dreading most quietly and most constantly finally stepping into the room and saying, "Yes, it's me, I've been here the whole time, you were right to be afraid." He had spent his entire relationship with the Kong brothers waiting for this. Waiting for the moment when one of them, or all 3, would look at him clearly and realize the mistake they'd made. He had told himself it was anxiety. He had told himself he was spiraling. He had tried, genuinely tried, to believe that what they had was real and sustainable and something he was allowed to have. And then Sung-jin had sat down at his counter and handed him a photograph and said, "You were right." He wanted to ask them. He needs you to understand that. He wanted to ask them badly enough that he practiced the words in his head, rehearsed different ways of saying it on his walk home from work, stood outside their bedroom door twice in the 2 weeks that followed and opened his mouth and found that no sound came out. Because every time he came close, his mother's voice was there, the particular voice she used when he was 16 and trying to get into a school she didn't think he was good enough for. "You're reaching, Yoon, you're setting yourself up, people like us don't get to want that much and then act surprised when it falls apart." He had spent years outrunning that voice, and Sung-jin had handed it a microphone. And then came the night that destroyed everything. He came home from work early, not much earlier, 20 minutes maybe, enough that they hadn't heard the door. The office light was on and the door was slightly open and he heard Min's voice first, the way he always heard Min first, that direct intensity cutting through everything. Min was saying, "We need to think about what we're doing here, we've been putting this off too long, Jihan, tell me you're not starting to doubt this." And Jihan said he wasn't doubting anything. And Min said, "Then we need to move, tonight, we can't keep waiting." Yoon stood in the hallway and heard those words and they landed on top of everything Sung-jin had put in his head and they fit perfectly, like a key into a lock that had been waiting for exactly that shape. He stood there for 11 seconds. He counted them later, in the weeks after, going over and over the moment the way you go over a car accident trying to find the point where you could have turned differently. 11 seconds with his hand against the wall and a positive pregnancy test in his coat pocket. He had taken it that morning, had been carrying it all day, had been trying to figure out how to tell them, and the words he'd heard rearranging themselves into the only shape his fear would allow. He couldn't let them reject the baby too. That was the thought. That was the specific, suffocating thought that overrode everything else. Whatever they decided about him, whatever conversation they were going to have, however gently Sung Jin had suggested they planned to end things, they could not know about the child and then decide no. He couldn't survive that. He didn't think he was strong enough to survive watching them look at proof of what they'd made together and choose to walk away. So he made the decision that he would walk away first, and he would take the proof with him, and they would never have to make that choice. He packed a bag that night while they slept. Changed his name the next week. Took a bus to a city close enough to get to quickly in an emergency and far enough that running into someone who knew him felt impossible. And he built a life in that city, small and careful and invisible. And 8 months later, Ren was born, and everything Yoon had broken himself to protect came out into the world with 3 men's jawlines and 1 man's eyes and the most watchful expression a newborn had ever worn. What Yoon did not know, what he would not know for 5 more years, was that the conversation he had overheard was the 3 brothers deciding which one of them should speak first when they proposed to him that weekend. Jihan had already made the dinner reservation. Soo had the rings in his desk drawer, 3 of them, 1 stone each, commissioned months before. And Min, sharp, blunt, allergic to sentiment in every context except the ones that actually mattered, had been quietly writing a speech for 6 weeks that he would, 4 years afterward, absolutely deny writing. The father had known exactly what he was doing. Part 3. 3 phones ring. Jihan Kong did not pick up calls from numbers he didn't recognize. In his line of work, with his level of visibility, that was a rule he'd kept for years. His assistant filtered everything, and anything that mattered eventually found its way to him through the right channels. So when his phone lit up with an unknown number that Thursday afternoon, he let it ring. Didn't think much of it. Went back to the contract he was reviewing and forgot about it within 90 seconds. What he didn't know, couldn't know, was that across the building Min had done the same thing, glanced at the vibration in his pocket during a meeting, silenced it without looking, made a mental note to have his assistant check the number later. 2 brothers, same building, same moment, same decision. The call went to voicemail and then, a few seconds later, rang again. It was Soo who picked up. He was standing at the window in his corner office watching the city settle into late afternoon when the screen lit up, and something made him look at it, something he wouldn't be able to explain later, some instinct that moved faster than reason. He saw the area code and something in him went very still. He picked up and said hello, and there was a pause on the other end, and then a voice came through that changed everything. Small. Young. Trying so hard not to sound as scared as it was. The voice said, "Hi, my name is Ren, my papa won't wake up and I'm scared and this was the only number on his phone and I'm sorry if I'm bothering you, I didn't know who else to call." Soo was in the hallway before the child had finished speaking. He was already dialing Min with one hand and moving toward Jihan's office with the other, and when Min picked up, Soo said 3 words, "We need to go," and Min was out of the meeting before he'd said anything else. By the time Soo reached Jihan's door, Jihan was already standing, keys in hand, because he'd heard something in his brother's voice that he hadn't heard in years, something he recognized from the last time the 3 of them had moved this fast, which was 5 years ago when they'd arrived at an empty apartment and understood that Yoon was gone. None of them said a word about why they were running. They just ran. They made it there in 31 minutes, and what they found when they arrived was a small apartment that smelled like him, still, unmistakably, despite the suppressants and the years and the distance, it smelled like him, and a 5-year-old boy standing in the middle of the kitchen in starprint pajamas with red-rimmed eyes and the steadiest expression any of them had ever seen on a child that age. The boy looked up at the 3 of them in the doorway and didn't flinch. Didn't back away. Just said, "You came really fast." And Soo crouched down to the child's level and said, "Yes, we did," and the child said, "Papa's on the floor and he won't wake up," and I was scared. While Jihan called for an ambulance and Min knelt beside the men on the floor, Soo stayed with the boy, who had not let himself cry until that moment, who had held it together through all of it because Papa needed him to hold it together, and only now, with someone else's hand steadying him, finally let himself shake. Yoon came back to consciousness in stages, the beeping of machines first, then the scratch of clean sheets, then the smell of a hospital room, and then voices, and the voices were the thing that dragged him fully back because they were the voices he had spent 5 years training himself not to hear in his sleep. Dangerously high fever. How long has he been like this? The doctor said another day would have been critical. His eyes wouldn't open. His body felt like it had been filled with wet concrete. But his ears worked perfectly fine, which meant he could hear every word, including the one that made his heart stop entirely, which was his own name spoken in Jihan's voice, the quiet, controlled, devastated version of it that Jihan only used when something had gotten past every wall he'd built. When he finally managed to open his eyes, the room was dim and private, the expensive kind of private, the kind he'd never been able to afford for himself, and Jihan was sitting in the chair beside the bed with the particular stillness of a man who had been sitting there for a very long time and had not moved, had not left, had not so much as shifted position because some part of him believed that the moment he stopped watching, something else would go wrong. He looked older. 5 years older, which sounds obvious but felt devastating to see. 5 years of something written into the tension around his eyes, into the way he held his shoulders, into the controlled careful neutrality of his expression that you knew, because he had studied Jihan's face for 2 years and memorized every variation of it, meant that the thing underneath hadn't found its shape yet. Yoon's first word was Ren. Not a question, a direction, a priority, the thing that mattered most. And Jihan said quietly, with Min and Sue. They took him to get something to eat. He wouldn't leave the waiting room. He cried when we told him you'd be okay, then stopped almost immediately and pretended he hadn't. Yoon closed his eyes again. How long? He asked. Jihan said, 19 hours. 19 hours since your son called us because you wouldn't wake up. 19 hours since we discovered that Yoon Park, the Omega we have been looking for 5 years, has been living 40 minutes away, under a different name, with a child we didn't know existed. His voice stayed perfectly, terrifyingly level. Yoon said, you need to leave. And Jihan said, no. And Yoon said, you've done enough, you can, and Jihan said, softer and harder at the same time, the doctor said another day without treatment would have been critical. You have pneumonia in both lungs. You're malnourished. You were 3 weeks from eviction. He paused. When is the last time you went to a doctor for yourself, Yoon? Not for Ren. For yourself. And Yoon didn't answer, because the answer was a number so large it would have made the machines beside him start beeping faster, and Jihan looked at him with the expression of someone who already knew the answer and was simply confirming what they'd suspected, and said, that's what I thought. And then the door opened. Part 4, Are These My Dads? Yoon had spent 5 years preparing for this moment. Not consciously, not with any real plan, but in the way that people who are running from something always carry the possibility of being caught, always running one mental simulation of what happens if the distance closes, always rehearsing the words, always trying to build some internal architecture sturdy enough to survive the collision. He had imagined it as a confrontation, mostly. He had imagined anger, accusation, the cold legal machinery of men with resources coming to claim what was theirs. What he had not imagined, what no amount of rehearsal could have prepared him for, was Min and Sue walking through a hospital room door with Ren between them, each holding one of his small hands, and Ren looking so profoundly, devastatingly right there. Not scared. Not confused. Just present, in the specific way that children are present when they have made a decision about something and are waiting for the adults to catch up. The three of them stood in the doorway for just a moment, and in that moment Yoon understood something he hadn't been ready to know, that the thing he had been most afraid of was not their anger or their judgment or their legal claim on his son. It was this. This image, exactly. His child standing between these three men like a missing piece that had found its place, the men looking at Yoon with expressions that had nothing cold or calculating in them, nothing of the confrontation he'd prepared for, but instead something raw and open and desperate that he recognized, with a kind of shattering clarity, as the same thing he'd been feeling for 5 years and calling by other names. Ren let go of their hands and ran to the bedside, and Yoon pulled him close, buried his face in his son's soft hair, and tried to remember how to breathe. Ren, being Ren, performed calm. He said, "Papa, you're awake, the doctor said you would be but you were asleep for a really long time." He said this with the measured relief of a child who has been holding something enormous and has finally been given permission to set it down. Then, in the same even tone, he reported that Sue had tried to juggle oranges and had dropped one. Sue, from the foot of the bed, said with great dignity that it had been intentional, a teaching moment. Ren said flatly, "You dropped it." And there was something so specific and so heartbreaking about that small exchange. This child, who had spent 5 years learning to be careful, learning to take up less space, this child who had grown up with only one person in the whole world and had made that enough, talking to these three men with the easy familiarity of someone who had already decided something about them without being told he was allowed to. Yoon looked up at all three of them over his son's head, and he felt the architecture he'd spent 5 years building start to come down around him. And then Ren leaned back, looked at his father with the seriousness that was his most consistent expression, and said, "Papa, are these my dads?" The room went absolutely silent. The monitors kept beeping, indifferent to what had just happened, and the afternoon light shifted slightly through the window, and nobody in that room moved or breathed in any meaningful way. Yoon couldn't speak. His throat had closed around whatever answer he might have had. It was Min who broke the silence, Min, who had been standing with his arms crossed and his jaw set since he walked in, doing the thing he always did when he was too close to something that mattered, which was build a wall of control so high that only people who knew him well could see that he was barely holding it together. Min said, quietly, in a voice with all the edges taken off, "That's a question your papa and I need to talk about." And Ren considered this with the gravity of a child who has already decided the answer and is choosing, charitably, to allow the adults their process. Then he said, "Okay. But Sue said he'd come back tomorrow. All three of you." He looked at Sue with an expression that was not a question. And Sue met his gaze and said, "I did say that. We will. If your heart just did what I think it did, hit the like button before you keep watching. Because this story is not close to over." What happened next in that room was both simple and the most complicated thing that had happened in years. Sterling brought Ren down to the aquarium in the hospital lobby. Apparently the hospital had won, a detail Ren had already catalogued and was determined to act on, and the three brothers and Yoon were alone together for the first time in 5 years. It was quiet in the way that rooms are quiet when they contain something that has been building pressure for a very long time. Nobody sat down immediately. Nobody wanted to be the first to define what this was. Jihan stood. Min stood with his back slightly toward the window. Sue was closer to the door, and Yoon had the sense that Sue had placed himself there not to block it but to make sure no one, including Yoon, felt cornered. They had learned him, once. They still knew how to be in a room with him. That understanding landed somewhere in Yoon's chest and it hurt, because it was evidence of something he had been telling himself didn't exist. Jihan spoke first. Not a question. The tone of a man who has rehearsed a sentence 10,000 times and has finally run out of places to put it. He said, "Why did you leave? Subscribe before the next part." Because what these men had been doing for 5 years, what the truth actually was, is something that is going to change the entire shape of this story. Part 5, The Real Reason. Yoon told them the truth. Not all of it at once, not cleanly, not in the way he had imagined telling it on the occasions when he'd allowed himself to imagine it at all. He told it the way real things get told when they've been kept inside too long, in pieces, with pauses, with the specific flatness of someone recounting something that was once devastatingly painful and has since been compressed into something manageable through sheer repetition. He said, "Your father came to see me." And the room changed. It was subtle, the change, not dramatic, not explosive, just a shift in the quality of the silence, a particular stillness settling into both Jihan and Sue that Yoon recognized as the thing that happened to them when something significant had been confirmed. He told them about the cafe. About the counter and the phone and the photograph of the three of them in the boardroom, serious-faced, bent over papers. About the way Sung Jin had said, they were discussing how to manage the situation. About the way he'd said it with such practiced gentleness, such apparent regret, the specific performance of a man delivering hard news he wished he didn't have to deliver. Yoon said, "He implied you were trying to find a way to tell me that didn't hurt me." And Sue said, very quietly, that the meeting in the photograph had been a contract renegotiation, that their father had been stalling the Incheon account for months and they had been forcing his hand. And Yoon said, "I know that now." He told them about the 2 weeks after that visit. About wanting to ask them and not being able to find the words. About standing outside the office door with an explanation in his mouth that wouldn't come out, about the voice in his head that belonged to his mother but had been put there partly by Sung Jin and partly by every person who had ever told him he was reaching too far. And then he told them about the night he overheard the conversation, about coming home early, about the light under the office door, about Min's voice saying we need to think about what we're doing here, we've been putting this off too long, we need to move tonight. He watched their faces as he said this. He watched the moment it landed. And he said, I was standing in the hallway with your father's words already in my head, and a positive pregnancy test in my pocket that I had been carrying all day trying to figure out how to tell you. And when I heard those words on top of everything else, they fit together into the only shape my fear would allow. He stopped. Then, I couldn't let you reject the baby too. That was the only thing I could think. So I left before you could. The silence that followed was long enough to be its own kind of answer. Ji-han sat down, and that small act of sitting down, for someone who almost never did anything without purpose, said more than any words he could have chosen. He sat down like the weight of what he'd just heard needed somewhere to land, and his body had made the decision before his mind had processed it. When he finally spoke, his voice was completely controlled, which you knew by now meant the opposite of what it looked like. He said, Our father came to you. Yoon said yes. He said, and told you we wanted to leave. Yoon said, he implied it. He said it carefully, with apparent kindness. Said you were trying to find a way to tell me that didn't hurt me. And then Soo spoke, and he spoke in a voice stripped of everything he usually used to soften things, the warmth gone, leaving something steady and bare underneath. He said, we spent 2 years paying investigators to find you. 2 years after that accepting that you were gone. A year after that actually trying, genuinely trying, to figure out how to move forward. We couldn't. None of us could, because nothing fit, because every potential path forward felt like settling, because we kept waiting for something that we couldn't name and couldn't stop waiting for. He paused. We were going to propose to you that weekend. We had the rings made. Ji-han had the reservation. Min had written a speech. Min said, with the flat certainty of a man who absolutely had written a speech, I had not. And Soo said, without looking away from Yoon, he absolutely had. It was Ji-han who said the thing that collapsed everything. He said it quietly, with the precision he brought to every sentence that actually mattered to him. He said, you were it, Yoon. You were always it. And our father knew that, that's exactly why he came to you instead of coming to us. Because he knew we would have told him to leave. He knew we would have chosen you. So he went to the one person he could reach. He went to the person he knew had never fully believed they were worth choosing. Yoon felt the tears come and didn't stop them. 5 years of architecture, the careful, load-bearing structure of a person who had decided that hope was something he couldn't afford, that wanting things led to loss, that the only safe position was to expect nothing and be surprised by nothing, all of it coming down at once, not dramatically, not in a flood, but in the specific quiet way that things collapse when the pressure has been building for long enough and the last supporting wall finally gives. He said, I should have asked. I should have just asked you. And Ji-han said, you were protecting your child. Don't apologize for that. That is the one decision in this entire story that was exactly right. But I took 5 years from you, Yoon said. And Min said, Min, who had been standing with every wall he had up, Min who processed grief as efficiency and emotion as something to be managed, Min said, yes. You did. And we're not going to stand here and tell you that's nothing, because it wasn't nothing, and we're not there yet, we might need time before we're fully there. But we are going to need that time with you present. Not 40 minutes away. Not under a different name. Here, where we can actually do something with it. That was when Yoon understood, finally, that this wasn't going to go the way he'd feared. It wasn't going to be legal threats or cold claims or the efficient machinery of powerful men reclaiming what they felt they were owed. It was going to be something harder and stranger and more terrifying than any of that, which was 3 people asking to be given the chance to love him correctly this time. Part 6, The Decision. They talked about practical things first, because practical things are easier and because sometimes you need to walk around the edge of something enormous before you can stand in the middle of it. The eviction notice. The apartment, which Min had apparently dealt with in a way that Yoon decided, for the moment, not to ask too many questions about. 2 weeks of mandatory rest, doctor's orders, no negotiating. Yoon said he would stay 2 weeks and then they would figure out co-parenting, what involvement looked like, what Ren needed and what the 3 of them wanted and how those things might fit together without anyone getting hurt. He laid these terms out carefully, with the quiet efficiency of someone who has had to be the only decision-maker for a long time and has gotten very good at it. Ji-han listened to all of it and said, carefully. Yoon said, and slowly. Jihan said, as slowly as you need. And Yoon said, and if it stops working we have that conversation like adults, not like people who run from things. Min said, with the very specific flatness he used when something landed harder than he wanted it to, instead of running. Yes, Yoon said. Instead of running. When Ren walked through the front door of the Kong estate the following morning, he stopped completely still in the middle of the entryway. He stood there for almost 10 seconds, head turning slowly, taking in the glass walls and the high ceilings and the light and the space, more space than he had ever been inside in his life, with the systematic thoroughness of someone conducting an assessment. Then he turned to Sue, who was closest, and asked in a completely serious voice, "Are we allowed to touch things?" And Sue, without a moment's hesitation, said, "Everything. This is your house too." Ren absorbed this. Then he asked if he could touch the fish. Sue said he could name them. Ren said he wanted to name them all Gerald. Sue said done. And just like that, the estate had fish named Gerald, 17 of them, all Gerald, and Ren moved through the rest of that first morning like someone who had been given permission he hadn't known he needed. The first week was careful in the way that new things are careful, everyone aware of the space between them, everyone choosing their steps. Everyone except Ren, who had no interest in careful and never had. Within 2 days he had mapped the entire house, identified the best window for morning light, developed a strong opinion about how the kitchen should be organized, and made a series of decisions about the 3 men that he communicated entirely through behavior rather than words. He watched Min from a slight distance for most of that first day, cataloging information with the patience of a scientist. He asked Jihan, with perfect seriousness, what all the papers on his desk were about, and then listened to the explanation with the focused attention of someone who intended to understand it. He followed Sue into the kitchen and provided a running commentary on his cooking technique that was so precisely, mercilessly observant that Sue had to look away at one point because he was close to losing his composure in a way that he couldn't fully explain. But it was Min who Ren chose. Not Sue, who was warmest. Not Jihan, who was most commanding. Min, who was the sharpest and the least accommodating and the most likely to give a direct answer rather than a managed one. 11 days into their stay, while the 2 of them were doing a puzzle together on the living room floor, side by side, neither looking at the other, both focused on the pieces, Ren asked, in the same even tone he used for all his important questions, "Do you love my papa?" There was a pause, and then Min said yes. Ren asked, "Did you always?" Min said yes again. And Ren asked, "Then why wasn't he with you?" Min was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Because adults make mistakes when they're scared. Your papa was scared, and so were we, and we didn't talk to each other when we should have. So things went wrong for a long time." Ren considered this, placed a puzzle piece, and said, "Are they still wrong?" Min said, "We're working on making them right." And Ren said, "Good." Then, after a pause, almost casual, "Papa smiles differently here." Min looked at him. "How does he smile differently?" And Ren said, "Like he means it." Min went back to the puzzle. Neither of them said anything else for a while, but something in the room had shifted, and they both knew it. On the 14th night, after Ren was asleep, Yoon came downstairs and found the 3 of them in the living room. Not arranged, not waiting in any formal sense, just present, the specific presence of people who have nowhere else they're trying to be. There was a gap on the couch between Jihan and Sue. Deliberate. Yoon sat. He said, after a while, "I keep waiting for the moment this starts to feel like a mistake. I keep waiting for one of you to look at me and start calculating what it's costing you." He looked at his hands. "I keep waiting for the part where I'm too much." Jihan said, "Look at me." And when Yoon looked, he said, "The only thing that was ever too much was 5 years of not knowing where you were. Whether you were safe. Whether the reason you left was something we did, or something we failed to do, or whether you had simply decided we weren't worth staying for. That was the unbearable part. Not this. This is not unbearable. This is exactly where I have wanted to be for 5 years." Sue said, "We still have the rings." And Yoon looked at him. And Sue said, "We're not asking you to wear them tonight. We're not asking you to be ready for something you're not ready for." The smile he gave then, the one that Yoon had been carrying in some private interior photograph for 5 years without letting himself look at it directly, that smile said, "We're just asking you to stay. To let us try. To let Ren have this if it's good, and to tell us honestly if it stops being good, so we can figure it out together. Yoon thought about 40 minutes away. He thought about 2 jobs and locked windows and the specific exhaustion of being the only person standing between your child and everything that could go wrong. He thought about Ren learning to pour his own cereal before Papa woke up. He thought about Jihan, 3 nights ago, holding absolutely still on the couch for 2 hours so Ren could sleep against his shoulder without being disturbed. He thought about that and then he made a decision, not grand, not dramatic, just a quiet internal choice that something was going to be different now. He said, "I'm not ready to bond yet. I need more time for that." They said okay. He said, "I need all of us in therapy, because there is a lot of history here and I am not willing to handle it badly twice." Jihan said the first appointment was whenever he wanted it. He said, "And if this stops working I will tell you, and we will figure it out, and nobody runs." Min said, "Nobody runs." And then Yoon said, "I missed you. Every day. Even when missing you was the most pointless feeling I had any capacity for, I missed you anyway." And the 3 of them said, "We know. We missed you too." Down the hall, in a room full of drawings that Ren had taped directly to the walls because Sue had told him everything was his, a 5-year-old slept without nightmares for the first time in longer than his father could remember. He didn't know yet what his 47-second phone call had done. He wouldn't understand it fully for years. But he had known, the way children know things before adults are ready to say them out loud, that those 3 men looking at his papa like that meant something. He had known it the first second he saw their faces in the doorway, and he had made his decision right then, and he had not wavered once. That's part 1. The bonding is coming. The whole truth about what Sung Jin did, and why, and whether the alphas will ever fully forgive Yoon for those 5 years, and whether Yoon will ever fully forgive himself, that's coming. But before you go, I need to ask you something. Yoon ran because he believed what he was told before he asked what was true. The alphas searched for 5 years without telling anyone, including Yoon, how desperately they were looking. Which one of them failed first? Tell me in the comments. I'll be reading every single one.